In general, I'm a very big advocate for child-centric education models. So something that truly puts the child at the center of the education. It's not about what's the best thing for the teacher, what's the most convenient thing when you have a classroom of 30 kids, like what's the easiest way to educate a child. It's what is actually best for the kid. And that's the most important guiding principle in how the education is presented. And there's lots of different models that run with this in mind, but this is one of the first things I look for in a school. Is like, okay, is the kid truly at the center? Like, is the child's experience truly what this thing is about?
My name is Lisa, mother of 8 and creator of the blog and YouTube channel Farmhouse on Boone. On this podcast, I like to talk about simplifying your life so you can live out your priorities. I help you learn how to cook from scratch and decorate on a budget through this podcast and my courses, Simple Sourdough and the Simple Sewing series. I also help people reach their goals from home through my business courses, Create Your Blog Dream and YouTube Success Academy. I will leave links to these resources in the show notes and description box below. Now let's get into the show. Welcome back to the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. Today, we're talking about homeschooling again. I've been talking about that more lately. A lot of you are curious to hear more about that, especially maybe you're in the earlier phases of motherhood and you're thinking about possibly homeschooling, or maybe you're already, you have kids school age and you're thinking about changing what you're currently doing, or maybe you're just strictly curious. I was listening, I forget what podcast it was, but I came across Hannah Frankman on another podcast interview, and she had such fascinating points about the history of education and then her personal education journey, because she was homeschooled her entire life, which it's interesting to hear from that perspective. And I wanted to bring her on this show because I thought a lot of you would find this interesting also. All right, let's jump into the interview. Hannah, welcome to the show. You're Hannah from Rebel Educator. Tell us a bit about that, and we'll get into homeschooling, one of our favorite topics, but I don't talk about it as much as I should on the show, and I get a lot of requests for it. So I'm excited to have you on. So yeah, give us a brief rundown of your story.
Yeah, so homeschooling is one of my favorite topics, so this is going to be great. I am a product of everything that I talk about. I grew up homeschooled from first grade all the way through high school. Didn't go to college, skipped the college path to go work in the startup world. I wanted to see if it was possible to be, quote, successful and like actually make a living without having a college degree, because everybody told me I couldn't do that. And I was a little bit of a contrarian at 18. So skipped college, went and started working in the startup world. Turns out you actually don't need a college degree to make a living working in business. And I realized while I was working professionally that I had a very different background from most of the people I was working with. Growing up homeschooled, I interacted with a lot of homeschoolers. I didn't really realize how different it was to be homeschooled versus just having the background of and the life context of having gone to public school for all of your childhood and adolescence. So started writing about my education experience and ended up over the years spending more and more time talking about my education, and then became more interested in alternative education more broadly. And now a lot of what I do in the day-to-day is writing about different forms of education, everything from homeschooling to different types of alternative and innovative schools, anything that puts the child at the center of the education as opposed to what's convenient for a system or a teacher or a classroom or an entire institution. So I've gone down a lot of rabbit holes over the past few years in terms of education, but homeschooling is always the one that's nearest and dearest to my heart because that's what started the whole thing for me.
Yeah. Oh man, so many things. I've thoughts coming to mind of stuff I wanted to roads I wanted to go down in that. First, you mentioned that maybe you grew up homeschooled and therefore you didn't have, I grew up in school. And so I have kind of the context of, I have a 16-year-old all the way down to a 1-year-old. So I've seen, and they've always been homeschooled their entire lives. So I kind of know a teenager as a homeschooler. And then I have the context of being, not being homeschooled and going to school. And I, of course, have my opinions about it, strong ones as well. But what were some of the key things maybe you noticed when you got to college? Or no, sorry, you didn't go to college. You were in the startup world. Some of the key things you noticed with people that you were working on projects. And of course, these are people who are already out on their own. So maybe they're already in a bit of a different position than somebody that you maybe would have met in college. What are some of the key things maybe you noticed?
Yeah, I mean, it took me a while to start noticing because I had been so homeschooled for so long that I didn't realize how different my frame of reference was to the people I was interacting with in the rest of the world. And it took people making comments about how they thought I had a lot of kind of kooky ideas, not in a bad way, just very different from what they would have expected in, like, you know, looking at a problem and coming up with a solution or different ways that things could be handled. Because I had been homeschooled, that's what they attributed it to. And that's what made me stop and think, wait a second, am I actually that different because I was homeschooled now that I'm an adult? And I think there are a lot of different things that were very prominent in how I engage with the world as a young adult, and that are still very core parts of my personality that I can trace back to being homeschooled. And one of the obvious ones that I think a lot of people talk about when they're talking about homeschoolers going to college or entering the workforce is that homeschoolers have had a lot more practice being self-directed than kids who have been in a classroom for 7 hours a day for 13 years being told what to do at every turn.
Right.
And I do think there's something to that, where it was very easy for me to transition from sitting at home being self-directed about what I was going to study that day to working for an employer, but being very self-directed about what I was going to work on. Like, it was very easy for me to be a self-starter because I've been practicing that for years, as opposed to the stories you hear about kids who come out of public school and they go to college, and it's such a rough transition because all of a sudden nobody's telling them how to spend their time during the day, and they have to figure out how to, you know, if you have a paper due at the end of the month, how do you budget your time to get that done? Like, that's a new skill often. And for me, it was just sort of second nature because I've been doing it for so long. There also was, when I was growing up homeschooled, I grew up in a household where questions and curiosity were very, very encouraged. So whenever I was interested in something, my parents would encourage me to ask more questions about it and go down whatever rabbit hole I was being compelled to explore. And I would spend lots of time reading books, or when I got older and I started using the computer and like using things like Wikipedia, going down internet rabbit holes, learning about different things. And I think I had a much higher curiosity drive than the average person I was interacting with in the regular world who had been publicly schooled. I think that was a really big one. And I think as a young person going into the professional world, I think this is less relevant now that I'm a more established adult, but early on, like, I was much less afraid of like people who were quote authority figures or people who were farther along in their careers than I was, because I never spent the majority of my time in an age segregated space where people who were older than me are like, ooh, scary. Like, we're not supposed to talk to them. And I think that made a really big difference in like my sense of drive and capacity early on in my career, where I was just like, I want to go talk to this person and learn how they do what they do so I can do it too. So I'm just going to go do that. Like, I didn't have any sense of like perceived barriers around who I could talk to and who I couldn't talk to, because I'd never been in an environment that had foisted that upon me.
Yeah, I think, man, there's, again, so many things. So you mentioned college and people having a hard time, like figuring out, okay, now I have an open block of time. What do I do? For me personally, that wasn't super hard. I actually did go to college, and looking back, like, it wasn't necessary for my life or anything like that. Like, I'm not saying I would recommend it, but I did. And I actually like totally understood how to do college. Like, I got it. Like, I had the classes, the assignments, and I knew how to direct my time. Personality wise, I'm a self-starter. What I struggled with was after college, I got married right away, got pregnant right away. And so I was a stay-at-home mom, or, you know, stay-at-home wife until I had the baby, because I was like, why get a job now? I'm about to have a baby. And figuring out what to do with a wide open day with nothing. Like, I didn't have a clue what to do. I didn't know, you know, where to even start managing my home, cooking, baking, learning new things by myself. I had no clue. Like, college was like, okay, I'm still in a class curriculum. Yes, I have free time with which to figure out how to study for the test, how to prepare for whatever. But I totally see what you're saying in that respect, because as a person who is a self-starter, it's funny to me that I was so unable to figure out like what to do with a wide open day.
Don't even get me started on this, because this is one of my favorite pet peeves, not just about public school versus homeschooling, but about our culture at large and how we raise our kids. We are terrified of free time and open space and boredom. And we have this knee-jerk reaction to avoid boredom at all costs, and it comes from it comes from us at us from all different angles, right? So we are hyper fixated as a culture on being super productive and always looking busy, and we start ingraining this in our children, like projecting it onto our children at a very young age. Like the 7-year-old who, as soon as they come home from school, they've got to go to soccer practice and they've got to go to piano lesson and they have swimming lessons. And it's so common. I talk to my friends and my family who have little kids and they're like, oh, we can't do anything on Tuesday because our kids have swim lesson and then they have piano after school. And I'm like, when do your kids play? They don't have any free time. But we're so hyper fixated on looking busy. And we use this kind of as a crutch. Like if you're super busy all the time, you don't really have to stop and think about, what am I doing with my life? And that's actually meaningful to me. You're busy, so you must be doing something productive. You're justifying the space you take up in the world. Like it's a very quick Band-Aid over any like existential fears or unexplored questions that you might have. Like if you're just busy, you don't have time to think about it because you're being productive. And this comes out all the time too. Like, I mean, think about how people approach a 9 to 5 that they don't actually care about, right? Like you go to the office and you're not you're not intrinsically motivated to do anything more than the bare minimum to keep your job, but you want to look busy all the time because then nobody's going to bother you and people are going to think you're valuable and worth paying. Like there's this sort of, as a culture, we equate busyness to worthiness.
Yeah.
But we're scared of boredom. Like kids come and bother, like your kid will come bother you and go, Mom, I'm bored. And it's like, oh no, that's a problem. We have to find something for you to do because heaven forbid you might get up to some mischief if you're bored. And I think this is a tragedy that we don't give our kids any space to be bored and to have openness. Because if you're busy all the time, you never learn how to stop and go, okay, if no one else is telling me what to do, what do I actually want to do?
Yeah.
How do I creatively want to solve my problem of boredom, which is where some of kids' best ideas come from, is as an antidote to their own boredom. But also, you're never giving them a chance to discover what it is that they want to do with themselves when they have no constraints on their time and how they're spending it, but also what they even like. Like if you always are prescribing activities for them, how are they going to know what they actually would like and would choose if they have space and time? And then to your point, like kids eventually reach a point in their lives where they have nothing scheduled for them and they're so lost because they've spent their entire childhood being told what to do all the time. And that's crazy to me.
It is. And I do want to point out that you are not immune from this if you're homeschooled. Like I'm around so many homeschoolers. I'm a homeschooler myself. So obviously most of the people I interact with are also homeschoolers. And we can fill our schedules because of the uncomfortable nature of having open blocks of time just as much as anybody else. There's so many programs for homeschoolers and it feels uncomfortable. At least for most, I don't know if it's most people, but for a lot of personalities, it feels uncomfortable to have a whole day that you have to figure out what to do with. And if you just plug them in, it's almost like you're making your own school in a way to a lot of things. You have to face that.
Yeah, but I don't think it's inherently uncomfortable. I think it's uncomfortable because it's foreign and because it's a skill that was never cultivated.
Right.
Like I don't think the average person is born with a fear of being bored.
No, absolutely
not. I think it's trained into you because it's always treated as a problem.
Yeah. Yes.
Like you're bored and somebody tries to fix it for you.
You're absolutely you think, not
being
born with that.
Being bored is bad. I have to avoid it.
Yes, because up to a certain age when you don't start, when you start preschool, you start soccer at like 3 or 4, they do just kind of toddle around and get into things. Like, yes, they need a lot of comfort from you, but they are totally comfortable with their whole day being, there's nothing going on. That's like what defines being a baby and a toddler. And then at some point we're taught, that's not what we do. I'm curious, what was your homeschool structure like as a kid? Because obviously your mom, even within the homeschool realm, did things a little bit more alternative.
Yeah, when I was it kind of shifted as I went through the different sort of epochs the of my like maturing process. So when I was in elementary school, my mom was very loosely following the Waldorf school curriculums because she thought they were very beautiful. She loved the emphasis on art and on natural materials and on exploring the physical world around you. And so we were very loosely following sort of year by year what kids in Waldorf schools are focused on learning. But it was very loose, it was very informal, and it didn't take very long because truly school does not take that much time to move through all the
Right.
materials, especially if you're home and you're just with your mom and she can work through materials with you. Like, it doesn't really take that long to get through first grade math. And
Yeah.
so
you can't even do that much or they'll burn out. Like
yeah.
you literally can't if you wanted to.
Yeah. So we would spend like maybe a couple hours a day doing school related things. And that was a very broad umbrella. Like, school related things could be learning how to bake bread or something. Like, it wasn't always sitting down with a book or a worksheet and learning about, working on your spelling or something. And then the bulk of my time was spent free playing. And there was no real structure to it. Like, I had a younger sister, so she and I would play a lot together. We didn't really have a lot of neighbors for most of my childhood. Like, we lived pretty rurally. There weren't other kids around for us to play with. So we were part of a homeschool group, and we'd meet up with them once a week and we'd take classes with them, and there'd be lots of like group playtime. But the bulk, like our average day, was we'd do some school and then we'd play. And we'd spend a lot of time playing outside. We'd go for long nature walks. We'd, play inside. We played make believe, all different sorts of imaginary games. It was amazing. It was the most wonderful childhood. I had the best time. And if I was ever bored, my mom would say, "What are you going to do about it?" And that was about it. And we'd be bored until we came up with something to do. And that was a good life lesson.
Yeah.
When I moved into middle school, we started to get more, like, there was a more tech involved in my education. So we started using online programs more and like video series and stuff like that. And then when I was in high school, most of my schooling was digital. And I was very academically inclined. Like, I just loved academic learning. And so I ended up having pretty full school days when I was in high school because there was just a lot I wanted to do. So I was watching recorded video lectures from like the teaching company and series on YouTube and things like that. And like I was reading the great books when I was in high school and stuff because I thought that sounded like fun. Like, I was just kind of a nerd.
Wow.
But it was very self-directed. Like, my parents were my mom always called herself a facilitator. So like, she was there to make sure I had everything that I needed and I was meeting state requirements. But beyond that, like, she pretty much let me be in the driver's seat when I was in middle school and high school. So I was the one deciding what it was I wanted to study and how I was going to budget my time and what I was going to work on every day, which was amazing. I was sad when I was a senior and realized that I should do something more like socially productive than just sit around and listen to lecture series every day when I was like the following year, when there was a big part of me that just kind of wanted to keep doing that. But it was awesome. It was very fun and it was very curiosity driven. Like, I knew there were things that I was supposed to be learning to meet the sort of state requirements. And at that point, I didn't know if I was going to go to college or not. So I wanted to make sure I had all the things I needed academically if I was going to apply for university. So there were some guardrails in that sense, but a lot of it was just me going, I really want to know how like human anatomy works, and it feels like it would probably be really cool if I like watch some cadaver dissections on YouTube so I like really understand what they're talking about when they're talking about fascia. So I'm going to go do that. Or like, I'm really curious about, like, I just think the beach is so cool and I want to learn more about what else is going on out there. And so I'm going to study oceanography. And then I'm like really curious about all the studies that have been done on on dolphin intelligence and whale intelligence. I'm like going to go down a
Wow.
rabbit hole with this because I think it's really cool. Like I was just all over the place and it was so much fun. So it was very emergent. Like there wasn't really a plan at the beginning of how it was all going to evolve. I think a lot of it was very tailored to me and my interests and like how I learned. Like my younger sister's homeschooling experience was very different because she was a very different student.
Yeah.
But mine was really great for me. I had the best time.
Yeah. And that's something to point out because it sounds like you're a very curious person. Like you naturally wanted to study all of these certain things. And not all children, of course, are like that. I do think that at some point, an interest will emerge and a lot of kids will go more deep maybe on one thing. And I think that homeschooling provides space for that. Now, you mentioned that you lived rurally, you got together with other students or other homeschool students maybe once a week or so. And that's obviously one of the biggest questions that everybody who talks about homeschooling ever gets ever. So let's talk a little bit about that. Is not being socialized actually a bad thing?
No. I think we use the term socialization in way too narrow of a context. When we talk about homeschoolers not being socialized, we're very concerned that they're not spending enough time with their peers and like their very immediate peers, like their grade level peers, the kids that they'd be in a classroom with, which is a very artificial form of socialization. Like this did not exist 100 years ago. Nobody was socialized only with kids of their own birth year until very recently in human history. Like for most of the history of education, kids were learning in schooling environments where they were interacting with kids older than them and younger than them. And they were part of a community where they were interacting with, you know, people of childbearing age and like the elderly and little kids. And it was a very broad sweep of sort of interacting with all the different stages of the human experience and being comfortable doing that. And I think there's something very antisocial about only socializing your kids with kids of the same age group. And then all adults are authority figures and younger kids are like not worth bothering with because it's not cool to hang out with them. Like you're teaching kids bad social habits by only teaching them to interact with each other in this very hyper competitive environment, which is you don't have a lot of distinguishing factors between yourself and other kids of your exact age group. And so you start getting hyper competitive about very petty things to sort of establish a social order. And, you know, a very exaggerated culture of bullying starts to emerge from that. And like a very sort of exaggerated social hierarchy that wouldn't really exist in the real world starts to emerge. And it's really detrimental for kids in a lot of ways because their sort of social interactions start to morph into these sort of ways that they wouldn't normally develop because they're trying to fit into this very artificial and sometimes very toxic environment that they find themselves in, especially if you're like lower in the like heap of the pecking order of how the social hierarchy is developing. Kids are not being socialized for the real world doing that. They're being socialized like conventionally, but is that even a good thing? Right. And even if your homeschool kids aren't interacting with 20 different kids of their birth year, they're probably being very well socialized in other capacities. Like if you can take your kids out into the real world with you and take them to the library on a Tuesday afternoon and they can interact with the librarians and the other patrons, or they're going to the grocery store with you on a Monday morning, they're interacting with the real world. Like they're being socialized. Unless you're keeping your kids at home and not interacting with anyone else besides you all day, every day, your kids are being socialized, and they're probably being socialized in a way that's actually much more real world beneficial than anything that they're getting in a classroom where they're sort of being cloistered away from the real world and not allowed to interact with it during normal business hours, which is a very strange idea. So I think the entire thing is kind of inverted when people say, oh, your kids aren't being socialized. It's no, like, no, your kids aren't being socialized. I'm sorry. But I think the homeschool kids are, like, they're interacting with the real world. Like, isn't that the best real world training they could be getting?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that when it comes to education, when it comes to people interacting with other humans and socializing, we don't step back and think, what's the goal of this? And we just take for granted what has been the thing since we've been alive. So like you said, this is a new way to do this. It's been around for maybe 100 years. But because that's how it's always been, it's just the assumption. Like if they don't hang out with 25 other kids their age on a regular basis, you are doing them a disservice, not really questioning, well, is that necessary? Is it absolutely necessary? And of course, kids who go to school can interact with the real world. I know this is the pushback, and I'm sure as somebody who talks a lot about homeschool, you've heard the same exact thing. Well, I take my kids to the library and we talk to the librarian after school. And so I know that, kids who go to school can interact with the real world, but
Totally.
saying that like the homeschoolers are missing out because they don't have 25 friends their exact age, the assumption is that that is important. And yeah, you and I are questioning, is it though? Is that really necessary?
Yeah, it's assuming that interacting with 25 other kids of the exact same birth year is important, but also assuming that is sufficient. Because I think to what you just said, It's like, well, my kids do go to the library after school. It's like, great. They're getting a broad array of different types of social experiences. That's amazing. But if they weren't going and having that experience too, just being in public school all day would not be sufficient to get them the type of experience that they're having by going to the library.
So the question isn't, does your kid have 25 friends their age? The question is, are you also interacting this child with the world? I guess that's kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. Because at the end of the day, you're preparing them to live a life as an adult. Having some experience in the adult world is probably going to be really helpful for them.
Yeah. And so much of what you said, I've never thought about, like the way that we distinguish ourselves when we're all the same age, because we're all pretty much on the same level. And then certain kids get left behind for one reason or the other. They're not particularly gorgeous, or they're not particularly good at sports. There's bad things on both ends of that, whether you are the popular one or the one who is getting picked on. There is this nature of being around this many kids that makes this, just ripe for happening. So
yeah. And then it gets segregated even more, because then you put the gifted kids all together and like the kids who need additional education, like support all together. And so then there's even fewer defining features between them. And like, it gets very like warped, the types of things that you have to start using as the differentiators in the social order. It's like, well, your nose is too big, so like we're gonna pick on you, or like something stupid like that in the real world nobody cares about, but like it's the only thing the kids can find. Like I got picked on for being a redhead at one point because it was like,
now that's like fine. It was the only, but yeah, when you're a kid,
it's like nobody cares.
In school, it's brutal.
But like they're looking for the thing that makes you obviously different so that they can distinguish you.
Right. They have to, because we're not based on age or a lot of different factors. Taking a quick break to tell you about today's podcast sponsor, Azure Standard. Azure Standard is a co-op style grocery market, if you will, where you can get organic bulk items, quality items. So for example, some of the things that I get organic raw cheddar cheese. I can find raw cheddar cheese, I think. Actually, I might not even be able to find that locally. You know what? I can't find that here. But if I could, it would be really expensive. I cannot find a 50-pound bag of hard white wheat berries or a 25-pound bag of soft white wheat berries, both things I got on my last Azure Standard order. I can't get those locally, and I can get them on there. So the way Azure Standard works is you find a drop location near you. There are a couple within a 30-minute radius of where I am. You can also establish your own drop location in your area if there isn't one. I'm thinking about getting one just for me and several people that I know so we can get it even closer to where we are. But likely there's already one established near you. You select that on the website and then start shopping for some things that you want to stock in your kitchen. There'll be seasonal produce for a really great price. I have been in the habit of getting a huge box of mushrooms. I'll have an organic, like all different varieties of mushrooms. And I just love having them to put on eggs or in a saute with onions on top of a steak during me and Luke's in-home date nights. Last time I got a lot of fresh herbs that really make things taste great all through the winter season, and for an excellent price, excellent quality. They only source really quality things, and you can also do the Azure Standard brand, so it's even less expensive. So shop around, price around. They're offering Simple Farmhouse Life listeners 15% off any product order of $100 or more for first-time Azure customers for orders shipped to a drop location with my code SIMPLE15. So we will leave a link down in the description box or the show notes below. Check out Azure Standard, find a drop location near you, start getting some of these things in your kitchen that maybe you've been intimidated to look for. I get people all the time who they want to mill their own grains, but they're like, but where do I get it? If you get on the Azure Standard order, you can just get them right in your local town because there's likely a drop already there. You can even meet like-minded people while you're waiting for the truck to unload who also prioritize health, wellness, organic ingredients. So it's a great community as well. Again, Azure Standard, AZURE, standard.com. Use the code SIMPLE15. So let's talk a little bit about public school. And of course, this will ruffle feathers like things tend to do. Why is public school so broken? And what's the history of that, like briefly? So loaded question.
Yeah, there's a lot here. So like I already said, public school is a very modern invention. It doesn't feel modern because in living memory for most people, it's all like your family has ever known.
Yeah, since we've been alive, since our grandparents have been alive. Well, for the most part.
But it's actually in the scheme of human history, it's extremely modern and it's an experiment. And it was developed in the late 1800s. The bulk of it was developed in the late 1800s. It was sort of nationally rolled out in the early 1900s. And it was developed off of the Prussian model, which when you go and talk about this on the internet, people love to come back and go, that's just a conspiracy theory. That's not true. But if you go back and you dig into the history of the education system, it's absolutely true. And the Prussians built their public education system to serve the purpose of assimilating their citizens, because the Prussians had a large body of their population who were not originally Prussian, who had been conquered in war and such, and they needed a way to homogenize the culture. And so they created an education system that was going to basically give every student a very standard Prussian education. And it also was a model that was intended to train future military leaders and future military like soldiers. And so it was a model that was intended for social cohesion. And Horace Mann, who's kind of the granddaddy of American education, went to Prussia to study their schools because he was trying to design an education system that was going to homogenize American culture. Because in the like 1880s, there were tons of immigrants. He was in Massachusetts, and which was sort of a particular melting pot at the time there were the Irish Catholics and the Italians, and they didn't get along. And there were, freed slaves who had moved up from the South and who were trying, like, not really fully integrating into the culture. And there were all of these different social groups, and there was a lot of social tension. And he intentionally wanted to design an education system that was going to create social continuity. And the goal was to also prepare a generation to work in a rapidly industrializing world, because the world was changing very quickly. And, for all of American history prior to this point, the majority of young people grew up in their small communities. There were lots of farmers. There was lots of very small business enterprises, but the world was changing to a much larger scale of industry and employment. Like, it was the Industrial Revolution. And so there was a need for young workers to be able to fit inside of the cogs of big industrial machines. So they need to be trained for different types of, like, specific types of work. So it was like truly a social experiment to see, can we train up a generation of kids where we can sort of engineer, like, okay, we're going to have this many people who are good at this job and this many people who are good at this job, and kind of funnel them into the different areas that this industrial economy needs. And that was the basis of the American education system, was training kids to be good industrial workers who were very patriotic and who were assimilated into the culture of being American, even if their parents were immigrants, and who were not too distracted by, like, this is actually in the literature of the people who created our education system, like, weren't too distracted by like poetry or like lofty sort of artistic ambitions, because, quote, like, we have enough of those already, is basically what they were saying. Like, we don't really need more poets, we need more industrial workers, so we're going to like give everybody the basic skills they need to go do that. And that's where our education system started, and that was the basis of it, is like train people who are obedient and who are socially cohesive and aren't going to ask too many questions. And that's basically the model we've been running ever since. And over time, the education was like, public schools became a national phenomenon. It was like very standard across the whole country, what people were learning and like the progression through the education system. The Department of Education was founded in the 1970s. It added an additional nationalization layer over schools that were still in large part like funded and controlled by the states. There's been, in the early 2000s, there was the No Child Left Behind movement that was, again, like adding additional layers of like national incentive structures for trying to put a Band-Aid on the problem of failing public school performance. There's a lot we can get into about the specifics of all this, and I'm happy to go down any rabbit holes that you are curious about. But it was a system that was designed to produce workers, basically, who were going to be socially cohesive and not cause any problems. And the bulk of the innovations that have happened since have not been academic, in spite of decades of research that's been done on how kids learn. Like, none of that's gotten integrated into how schools actually teach kids. There haven't been a lot of innovations to like what's actually in the curriculum. The bulk of the changes that have happened since have been different incentive structures that have been put in place to make it to incentivize like school performance, basically, like heavier and heavier emphasis on testing and like state testing and national testing, right, and funding that's tied to test scores. So like teachers are incentivized to get their kids to perform well on tests, or they're going to lose their funding as an attempt to like get the national test scores to rise. Very few innovations in terms of how we're actually teaching kids and what we're teaching them for, even though the world that public schools were designed for no longer exists.
Oh, totally different world. My question is, was there a lot of pushback when it first was introduced? Like, how long before people just accepted it as the status quo?
So around the turn of the 20th century, it was very in vogue to have opinions about education in America. It was a thing that was changing. I think there was a general sentiment that more education is good, and we want our kids to be prepared for the world that they're going to be, this changing world that they're going to be entering into. And so people were in general very bullish, I think, on a public education system. And lots of people had lots of opinions about how it should look and what it's, in the same way. It was like one of the hot topics of the day, in the same way like immigration is a big topic of 2025. Like, it was the sort of thing that everybody had an opinion on.
Okay.
There wasn't a ton of social pushback that I'm aware of. I'm sure there were lots of people who had opinions about it, but it wasn't something, like, to my knowledge, it was something that was like fairly, there was a lot of debate internally amongst the people who are building the education system, like, what should this be and how should we do this? But it was like a pretty fast sweep of expansion, where I think there was a sense that the world is really changing and we really need a better way of educating our kids. And like, it's a good value proposition too, right? Like, the state is gonna fund schools and all the kids can go for free. Like, it sounds
right. Yeah. And
amazing. It sounds like a good idea.
And with anything like that's brand new, it takes us a while to question it and to become skeptical. So like one example recently, of course, is social media. When it first came out, there was no question. Everybody's getting an account. It wasn't like, I don't know, like, I'm not sure if this would be a good idea to put everything I ever do and my children and just everything online. And then as the years progress, people are blurring their kids out, putting them in less and less, deleting apps off their phone. changing the like just taking off all of the notifications, and just it, as time goes, like we only could see the upside in the beginning. And I'm wondering if that's kind of how that felt at the time.
Yeah, I think, like, in my mind, the public education system is a failed experiment. And all you have to do is go look at the academic outcomes of, like, we rank 36th in the world for literacy. We're one of the wealthiest, most highly developed countries in the world, and we can't even teach our kids how to read at the same level that 35 other countries can. Like, we're spending so much. We spend $15,500 per child per year on public school.
I would spend close to that.
Yeah, you don't have to spend that much if you're doing it yourself.
Loss of salary, like for a mom that's staying home to homeschool their kids, obviously you could have gone out and gotten a job. So obviously it is more than that when you factor that in.
But there are other workarounds that are significantly cheaper, right? Like, people build micro schools that are significantly cheaper than that, where you're pooling resources and you have 10 kids in a living room or a church or something like that. And you're pooling resources to pay a teacher and pay for any overhead that the school requires for supplies and stuff. But it doesn't take $15,500 per child per year, especially when you're doing it at scale. So you have,
like 30 kids per.
Yeah, like, that's so much money to run like a second grade classroom. It's ridiculous. And
that's true. Yeah.
If you include higher education and continuing education, we spend 6% of our GDP in America on education, but we still have abysmal outcomes. 1 in 5 Americans are functionally illiterate.
Really? What exactly does that mean? Like,
54% of Americans can't read at a 6th grade level. Half of Americans can't pass like a 6th grade reading test. Being functionally illiterate, there's a spectrum of different stages of literacy that you can. Then sometimes there's different ways of measuring it. Sometimes it's measured by grade level. Sometimes it's measured by like different sort of tiers of reading capacity. So many adults in this country can't even read, which is the basic, base thing that school is supposed to teach you are the 3 R's: reading, writing, and arithmetic. And we can't even do that. I want to say it's like 30% of 8th grader, only 30% of 8th graders in America can do math at grade level. Like, the numbers are horrific. And like, if this was a privately funded thing, like, everybody would fire the public schools because they're not doing their job. But because it's so nationalized and so bureaucratic, it's difficult to change, but it's also so socially accepted that that's where you send your kids for them to be okay, that nobody even questions it. It's kind of crazy.
Where does it go wrong? Because I know there's a lot of very good intentioned people in the school system who are doing their best. Is it just the way it's structured? Like, it's an impossible task because you're so focused on managing the classroom. Where does that break down?
I think it breaks down on multiple levels. I don't fault teachers for the bulk of this. Like, it's not their fault. They're dealt a losing hand and said,
they're just doing their job.
Go win with this. And they're like, we'll try.
Yeah.
It's not their fault. And most of them have known nothing besides the public school system, right? Like, they went through it. They went to college to study to be a teacher immediately after. And then immediately upon graduating from college, they go work in a classroom. So it's all the context they've ever known. But the system is designed to, not intentionally, but the way it's designed effectively just sets teachers up to fail from the beginning, because they're handed a classroom of 30 kids, and not all of those kids are at the same academic level. Even if they're, out of all the kids in their district, they're like the closest to being in the same academic level. They're still not. Like, some of the kids are going to know things that other kids don't. Some of the kids are going to be more behind. And so from the very first day, the teacher, like, the entire system is set up for failure, because the way kids learn is sort of on an incremental trajectory where they have to learn one thing at a time in order to unlock the next piece of knowledge. And this is particularly true in subjects like math, where it's very linear. You have to learn addition and subtraction in order to learn multiplication and division. You have to learn multiplication and division in order to get into things like decimals and fractions. And a passing grade technically in most schools is like 60 to 70%. So you can learn, like, what that functionally means is you can learn 60 to 70% of the material, be missing 30 to 40%, but still have passed and move on to the next level with huge holes in your knowledge. And so the more you progress through a subject, and math is a good example of this because of how linear it is, you're doing, pre-algebra, but you never actually really understood how fractions work. And so you can't do all the pre-algebra work because anytime a fraction comes up, you don't know how to handle it, or you handle it incorrectly. And so you're building this structure on a porous foundation that's just full of holes. And so the whole thing eventually is going to like settle at a weird angle or come down altogether. And that's not the teacher's fault, but they don't have a choice because they have to keep the classroom moving. If they always wait for the last kid to catch up, they won't move through all the materials, and they have to move through all the materials because they have to prep the kids for the tests that are coming up throughout the year, because that's how the teachers are being measured. That's how the school's being measured.
Yeah.
And so the whole thing structurally, like, the teachers don't have a choice.
Right.
And I do think this is something, like, as the capacity of AI expands, there are lots of AI-driven learning tools that are able to use, like, flat out AI or even just machine learning to tailor curricula to a kid's test scores. So, like, if you're doing a lesson and then a quiz, and at the end of the quiz, the software can see that you got like 2 out of 20 questions wrong, it can tailor the next lesson to make sure that those questions get addressed and you don't learn anything that requires mastery of those things until you've proven via a quiz that you've mastered them. So it can very quickly do what a teacher can't, which is update the actual, like, learning material, like the lesson and the tests, around exactly where a kid is. And so that type of software allows for the type of, like, curricular advancement through, or like a child's advancement through a curriculum, that a teacher in front of a classroom can't do if they're working with more than a couple of kids at a time. And so if you integrate something like that into a classroom, it changes everything. But the model that we've been running forever, where you just have a teacher in front of the classroom manually doing all this with the kids, there's nothing they can do.
Right. That makes sense. So do you think they will start to change the system now that AI is so, like, it's cutting edge, but it's going to be in everything?
How much did the education system change when the internet came online and all of a sudden all resources were available at the click of a button? Not very much. And I anticipate the same thing will also be true with AI. If we continue on the same path that we're on, little things will change, but the system itself won't, even though it could, and even though it would solve the bulk of the problems if it did.
Yeah. When Luke and I were first married 17 years ago, we were on a super tight budget, and the only way that I could decorate my home and make it my own cozy space was by doing a lot of DIY and sewing. I've shared that for years on my YouTube channel, on this podcast, on my blog, and recently I put all of those resources together, all of the patterns, the tutorials, and then step-by-step instructions, from getting a machine and threading it, learning about tension issues and the bobbin, all those things maybe over the years that have scared you away from sewing, into one course that I've called the Simple Sewing Series. If you've wanted to sew but have been intimidated by the process of getting started, or even if you're a more seasoned seamstress or sewist and you want to improve your skills, I really think that this will be a great resource for you. There's also a private community associated with it, so if you have sewing questions or you're excited to meet other people who are also getting started on their sewing journey, that's available with the course as well, and it's for a very affordable price. You can find my new course and all of the resources that go along with it over at bit.ly/simple sewing course. That's bit.ly/simple sewing course, all lowercase. That's where you can find more info and become a student. What school models? I know you talk about more than just homeschooling. How does one choose a school for their kids?
I don't really have like a singular model that I think is the best. People ask me this all the time, and I think it's very child dependent. And I think that's important context to how I answer this question, because like I truly don't think every child should be in any schooling model I've ever seen. I think a lot of it hinges on the kid. I think a lot of it hinges on the nuances of the options that are actually available to you. Like maybe for a child, Montessori is objectively the best option, but they just don't jive with the local Montessori classroom and teacher. Like it's just not a fit, even though they do very well in a different Montessori school. And a lot of it hinges on the family. So I think there's different sort of verticals that you have to think through to start to figure out, like discern which of the options in front of you is actually the best. So there's like the very logistical things of what's in your area or available online, what can you actually afford, what logistically is like going to work with the rest of your family's schedule and logistics. Like maybe one of your kids would do best in a Waldorf school, but the Waldorf school is 30 minutes away in the opposite direction of where your other kids go. Exactly.
Yeah.
Like there's very like logistical constraints that you have to think through. And those are very real. And that's a really important part of the calculus of figuring out what's actually a good fit. But for the child itself, in general, I'm a very big advocate for child-centric education models. So something that truly puts the child at the center of the education. It's not about what's the best thing for the teacher, what's the most convenient thing when you have a classroom of 30 kids, like what's the easiest way to educate a child and systematize it across a national education system. It's what is actually best for the kid. And that's the most important guiding principle in how the education is presented. And there's lots of different models that run with this in mind. But this is one of the first things I look for in a school. It's like, okay, is the kid truly at the center? Like, is the child's experience truly what this thing is about? And once you've found options that sort of check that box, then it just kind of depends on the kid, right? So your child may really, really like independent, like focused structure, like a structure that allows them to be very self-directed inside of the structure, but like encourages focus and like deep work. And maybe your child needs that too. Like maybe your child's very unfocused and they really need a school structure that's going to help them spend time practicing these long bouts of being very focused on something. And if that's your child, then maybe Montessori is the best option. Maybe your child really likes being outside all of the time, and something like a forest school where the kids are out in nature all the time is going to be the best option for them. Maybe you don't have a great school locally, but there's an online school that like really caters to your kids' interests. Like your kid's really interested in programming or entrepreneurship or something like that. And there's a virtual school that caters to that. I think you're looking for things that are a culture fit for your kid, but that are also encouraging both your kids' strengths, but also supporting them in their weaknesses. A place where they really jive with the teachers and like the adults in the room, but they also really jive with the other kids. Like if your kid has a very specific set of interests and has a hard time making friends, I think it's worth going out of your way to help find a school where other kids like them that they'll get along with are going to, where they're going to find them and be able to connect with them. And I think a lot of it too is like, you know, if your kid's really academically advanced, like, is the school going to support them? And if your kid isn't ready for things that, you know, they're in second grade and they still don't really like reading that much, and you don't want your kid to be pushed because you don't want them to hate reading later because they were forced to do it before they were ready.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
can you find a school that will support that? And then once you have your kid in a school, like, are they happy? Like, do they come home excited about what they're working on? Are they making friends? Do they like their teacher? And if they don't, like, are you willing to say, okay, this school isn't supporting my child. I'm going to pull them out and enroll them somewhere else. Because I think that's really important too. Like, you're not always going to get it right the first time or the second time or even the third time. And I think you really can't have a sunk cost mindset about it. You know, if your kids spent a year or two in a school that's not really supporting them, at the end of the day, it's not going to hurt them that much to pull them out and put them somewhere else while they'll spend years thriving. It's worth making the leaps to find the thing that really supports your kid. But I think you have to both you have to trust your gut. You have to trust the fact that you know your kid better than anybody. And if you're really listening to your kid and truly thinking about from their perspective, what's going to support them, like being willing to use that as the lens through which you're looking at different schools. And then finding the one that's both the culture fit for your kid and the culture fit for your family. Like, I don't think there's a I don't think there's a single right answer for everybody. I don't even know if there's a single right answer for some families. Like sometimes there's 2 or 3 schools you could pick that would be great. But I think you have to really trust yourself going through the process. And I think you have to ask questions not about, okay, it's like, but what are my kids' test scores going to be like? Or what are the average test scores here? Like, what kinds of colleges do kids get into coming out of this school? Like, I don't think those are the right questions to ask. I think the right questions to ask are very culture based, because at the end of the day, if your kid feels excited about where they are and they feel pumped about the learning environment, that's what's going to support them in really thriving.
Yeah, and becoming lifelong learners, which to me is the ultimate goal, because if you keep learning your entire life, then you don't need to cram it all into the 18 years. We're trying, that is the entire goal, is to create students who forever just want to continue learning new things.
And are able to. Like, if you and I stopped learning after we finished our traditional education, that was it, we wouldn't be here now, because neither of us would know how Riverside works to record a podcast, because it didn't exist yet. Like, you have to be able to adapt to your changing world. Like, it's so important to be a lifelong learner.
It absolutely is. I mean, everything that I use for my career right now, I learned in the last 10 years. And it's been a lot of learning between blogging and video and, everything. I've become a photographer. Like, it's the most important skill. Like, all the other skills can, obviously you have to learn to read, write, and then to continue learning. That's like the entire goal of the entire thing. And a lot of different models could lend to that. But I think keeping at the forefront of your mind what the goal is something that we don't ask often enough. So tell us where we can listen to your show, learn more from you, for those who are intrigued, but maybe want to hear just more of what you have to share, where we can find that.
Yeah. So I host a podcast. It's called the Hannah Frankman Podcast. I release episodes every single week. I talk to all sorts of people in the education world, researchers, professors, and like psychologists, people who are entrepreneurs building different types of schools, people who've graduated from unusual programs. So you can find that on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. If you're on Instagram, you can find me there. If you're on Twitter, I spend a lot of time on Twitter. That's where I post that's sort of like the central hub of all the things that I'm doing.
Man, I haven't been on Twitter in forever. I need to.
It's the best.
Is it? I literally have been on there, probably spent like 1 hour my whole life.
I love Twitter. You can find me posting both my personal Twitter at Hannah Frankman, but that's also where Rebel Educator is hubbed. So at Rebel Educator on Twitter, you can find tons of stuff there. And my profiles everywhere will like link to everything else. So like whichever one's kind of your jam, go start there, and then you'll be able to find whatever else you're looking for. But yeah, Twitter's great. There's a lot of really great education people who spend a lot of time writing interesting things. I actually think you would find it interesting.
I probably would, but since I have 8 kids that I'm already
there's also that.
I got convinced of all of this approximately 16 years ago and never looked back. But I do love speaking to people who are still thinking about, but maybe doubting themselves. And that'd be another whole podcast episode entirely. But I think the biggest hang up is like, yeah, I agree with all this, but like, I can't do it. Mm-hmm. And so you probably have some content on that on your podcast as well, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones, because the education system will really hammer that in. Like, teachers will go, you're not qualified. It's like, I'm sorry, I went through your whole program. I think I should be.
Yeah, that was literally what I said from day one. I was like, listen, I have 12 years. Like, I graduated with a bachelor's. And so if I'm not qualified, I mean, I don't think that's what really qualified me. I'm just saying, like, from that logic.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, we will leave links down in the show notes in the description box below. Hannah, thank you so much for joining us. This was a really interesting, eye-opening, and fascinating conversation.
This was very fun. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, as always, for listening to the Simple Farmhouse Life podcast. My husband Luke and I and our 8 kids work together side by side on our little homestead and use our blog, podcast, and YouTube channel to reach other homemakers, home cooks, and homesteaders with practical recipes in daily family life. For everyday sourdough recipes, make sure to check out our blog, farmhouseonboone.com. And to dig deeper, we do also offer a course called Simple Sourdough over at bit.ly/farmhouse sourdough course. That's all one word, bit.ly/farmhouse sourdough course. If you're looking to learn how we earn an income online, check out my free blog success masterclass at bit.ly/farmhouse blogging school and my YouTube course at bit.ly/farmhouse YouTube course, all one word.